have the privilege of introducing Lauren Carlton. She is presenting her lecture called Directing Intimacy for the Operatic Stage. And this is a part of our 2022 Artists in Conversation series, Contemporary Storytelling in Classical Music. So Lauren, she does many things. She is a director, she is a singing actor, she is an intimacy choreographer. She didn't put this in her bio, but she's also an educator, and does many traveling fun productions. She currently teaches acting at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, and she is a visiting lecturer in opera studies. Prior to being at Lawrence, she was the director of theater and an assistant professor at Theater of Tabor College in Hillsborough. And she holds an MFA in theater performance and pedagogy from Texas Tech. Texas Tech. That's a mouthful. She also has a BA in journalism with a self-design minor in opera performance from the University of Alabama. Her research and practice as an intimacy director has taken her across the United States as a presenter, as an educator, and as a choreographer. Her highlights include the National Opera Association's national conferences and workshops with Baylor University, Minnesota State University Mankato, University of the Pacific, and University of the Alabama Opera Theater as well. Her areas of interest and specializations are in consensual intimacy, historic representations of intimacy, and intimacy in devised theater and new play development. She is currently the intimacy choreographer for the new musical Here There Be Dragons by Chase O'Neill and Theo Terrace, premiering in 2022 at the Players Theater in New York City. So I think that's all my business, and that was a lot of things because that is how Lauren is. But Lauren, why don't you please take it away?
Goodness, thank you so much, Abby, for that generous introduction, and thank you to Renegade Opera for having me. I am so excited to be here with you all and to share the next roughly an hour with you all. And as Abby mentioned, I invite you to participate however you feel most comfortable. To kick us off, since we are a relatively small cohort this evening, if you feel so inclined, I would love to know who you are. So if you wouldn't mind maybe putting your name, where you're zooming to us from, and your pronouns, if you feel comfortable sharing them in the chat. That way, when we have moments for discussion, we have a little bit of a groundwork to already work from. So you can go ahead and put that in the chat, and what I will do on my end is I'm going to start to share my screen with you. If at any point you have issues hearing me, folks, please let me know, and I will do my best to reacquaint myself with the room at large. All right, here we go. All right, so if you are here for directing intimacy for the operatic stage, you are in the right place. Welcome. So excited to embark upon this Zoom journey with you all this evening or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. So this is a rough draft of our agenda for today. The purpose of this lecture isn't to make us all intimacy directors, intimacy professionals by the end of an hour. However, I hope that we can leave this conversation with an understanding of what stage intimacy is and can look like. We'll introduce the role of an intimacy director. We'll also discuss how an ID would go about directing intimacy for production. And then, of course, there'll be room for questions and answers, and then we'll have a brief moment of closure. In order to provide a little bit of context, I offered this to you all, which is I am one voice, so please note that in this presentation that what I'm sharing is not the end all be all for stage intimacy, but rather my experience that I've gathered over the last couple of years, and my perspective on work that is continually evolving and work that I'm continuously studying and practicing. So I might very well come back to one of these slides in a month, 3 months and say, oh my goodness, I wish I had included this, that, or the next thing. Again, I invite you to engage however you feel best. If you care to come on camera, I would absolutely welcome. If you prefer to stay in the chat or to jot down your own ideas, off camera, off chat, wonderful. This work does have a tendency to bring up a lot of anecdotal stories that might feel quite personal to us. So I want to honor those stories in this time and space, but I do ask that we will hold on to them until the very end, just so that we can have time as a group to process some of the information that we'll all share together. All right, so first and foremost, a large question for us all, which is, what is stage intimacy? I'm going to pull up the chat right here. If you feel comfortable or you'd like to come on camera and share what you think stage intimacy could be, this is not a graded test. I welcome it. We'll give ourselves about 15 seconds to maybe jot down some ideas. Chat. And I'll go ahead and read some of what I'm seeing in the chat. So I've seen scenes in which you need to touch or engage with another person, crossing into someone's bubble, creating a believable scene for the audience that honors and doesn't harm the participants in the scene. Yes, we love the word honoring and not harm. Anything that requires vulnerability, physical or emotional. Wonderful. Thank you all so much for these responses. So right off the bat, we're all correct. Fantastic. So stage intimacy oftentimes exists in one or several of these following categories. They can include moments that live under the umbrella of what we would largely consider to be sexual intimacy. That tends to be, for most folks, the immediate jump we make when we think of what intimacy could exist or could look like for stage. That might include kissing or in a variety of simulated sex acts. Intimacy for the stage can be familial, right? A hug between a parent-child relationship is a moment of very intimate and close touch. Intimacy can also include violence. That might mean that an ID, an intimacy director, is then in conversation with a fight director, depending on the context. Intimacy can certainly be emotional, as one of our participants brought up in the chat. And stage intimacy also encompasses nudity, whether that's full nudity or partial nudity, meaning that we're asking an actor or a singing actor to undress to, say, undergarments. So I pulled this quote for us all about the role of an intimacy director. It's a little old, it's from 2018 from an article for the Huffington Post. I won't read it to you. You're welcome to read it though. But I find that in this quote, it's a lovely and succinct offering as to what an intimacy director is. And I will point out a couple of things that I really love. They're hired to facilitate scenes for the stage and screen involving physical touch, but in many cases, their most important role is their most passive. They're the person in the room whose job it is to discuss and understand an actor's comfort with various aspects and types of touch in scenes of physical intimacy. Wonderful. So we might ask ourselves, why is this important, right? We've had moments of theatrical intimacy for hundreds and hundreds of years in theater, and since before the word theater itself even existed. So I offer us a couple of tenets as to why we want to pay some special attention to stage intimacy. One being that an intimacy director's job is to create clear, repeatable, and visually interesting storytelling that's rooted in technique and not just chemistry. They are there to have an eye towards the safety of the singing actor, and they're there to facilitate communication between singing actors and between singing actors and their directors in order to tell the story of the opera. So those are a number of conversations that are all happening with ultimately the same goal. And my job as the ID is to figure out where all of these different voices and perspectives are coming from and make sure that we are on track to create the same story versus, right, 4 different stories, for example. So a couple of past practices and power dynamics that we're up against in this work that are getting better, I would say quite largely, but are still prevalent because a number of us have come up through through a theatrical system in which some of these past practices have been elevated or great importance has been placed in them. This idea of the phrase yes and, if we have any singers in the room or singing actors in the room, right? The idea that whatever happens, happens, and we just keep going and we make the best of it, right? In fact, I heard an anecdote about that just not 20 minutes ago from a singing actor. So we have that to contend with. In general, most of us want to be seen potentially as lovely colleagues who are ready and hungry and prepared for the work, and we want to be easy to work with. We want to cause as little drama, as little consternation in the room as possible. And there's a fine line between being easy to work with, but also prioritizing your own safety and your needs, which is important, right? Prioritize lowered inhibitions. I can say, speaking from an I place, that I definitely felt as a very young singing actor that the most impressive actors were the ones who were just fearless, willing to do anything. And I didn't necessarily think about in my own work what that meant when I maybe didn't want to do something, or when I actually was quite fearful of engaging with a moment or an area of content that was perhaps challenging for me. So we have these, I guess, ideas that we're sort of trudging through as a theatrical community, as well as the fact that stage intimacy is a relatively new field as far as the role of a stage intimacy director being a point person to turn to. Now, folks have been staging intimacy for as long as theater has been in existence, and some with a variety of practices and methodologies for going about that. But we've really seen a boom within the last decade, especially in theater, television and film, and opera as well. But most practicing directors and singers might not have necessarily encountered a, say, stage intimacy course in their undergraduate training if they're coming from an academic background, or in their directing 101 class. Now we're starting to see that change, which is really exciting, but we have to know that a number of folks might not necessarily be coming from a place of maliciousness if they haven't been asked to think about stage intimacy in this level of detail. So I offer that with perhaps a sense of grace as we continue to welcome everyone into the fold of stage intimacy, knowing that this is an offering to help us all create work in which we can really excel, versus you're not doing this, so you're subsequently wrong. So I also want to address power dynamics that that exist within a rehearsal space. This could be its own separate hour-long presentation, so I'll zip past it, but please know that's not because it's important, because it is, but a really juicy amount of time should be dedicated to it. But a couple of big ones, right, are the director to cast power dynamic. How does that operate, especially if, say, I, as the director in the production that all of us in this Zoom room are going to put on, ask us all to do something? Well, then I've stepped into a position of power, just that's inherent by that title of director. Now, if you're creating in, say, an academic setting, I know we have some students in the space, that shifts a little bit depending on your role in the academic sphere, whether you're a faculty or student, a graduate student, an undergraduate student. And those are only a couple of power dynamics that exist. There are so many other ones depending on the culture of the space, the country you're creating in, etc. All right, I'm going to pause us there. Are there any questions or moments in the chat that I have not fielded yet before we move on in greater detail? Not seeing anything in the chat, so I think we're good to keep going. Okay, beautiful. Thank you, Abby, for your Very clear head shaking. Appreciate it. All right, folks. So a company that has since closed but has morphed into another company, Intimacy Directors International, closed in March, I believe, of last year, and they have since kind of morphed into Intimacy Directors and Coordinators. But back when they were still IDI, they formulated a list of 6 pillars. And this list is largely informed by that. Rather than using the term dramaturgy, they use the word context, I believe. But I like the word dramaturgy because it helps me, as a creative, think about the world of the play or the world of the opera a little bit separately to the world of my world that I'm currently living in and operating in. So it really kind of depends on your preference. But these are largely the 6 pillars that they use and that I continue to use in my own work as an intimacy director. The first being preparation, followed by consent, dramaturgy, choreography, communication, and closure. So during this next little section, largely what I'll do is ask a lot of questions. So that might be a little frustrating for some of us who are really quite answer driven, but we'll have time to chat a little bit at the end about how might we engage with some of these large scale questions that I'm going to offer. So in preparation, here are some, not all of the things I'm thinking about as an intimacy director. And as a director, depending on the context that I'm working in, right, whether that's at the university level or in, say, a project like Here There Be Dragons, which is outside of academia. So I'm going to look to state my expectations for all intimate moments that exist within the work in everything that potential auditioners will see. So for example, if I know that there's going to be a kiss between character A and character B, I'll list that in the character breakdown. And what that will look like is character A has a 4 to 8 second kiss with character B in a consensual moment or something to that extent. I could go into as much detail as I wanted or keep it relatively broad if I and the director didn't necessarily know the specifics. But my goal is to give as much detail as possible so that the actors who are auditioning, the singers who are auditioning know, and they're not surprised when they walk into, rehearsal number 4 and I say, oh, well, now a couple of weeks from now, we're going to be looking at the kiss. And they're like, this is news to me. So that's important. Also, we want to be sure that we're giving the singing actors space to communicate their responses, because it does me no good as the ID or the director if I've listed everything that's involved, but I don't know who's comfortable or willing in engaging in any of these moments on stage. So how I like to articulate that on my paperwork is I'll kind of list all of the moments and then I'll ask, is this a moment that you would be willing to perform on stage? Please know that this is a living and breathing document. And if your answer to these questions change at any time, we can continue the conversation. And there'll be a yes, a no, or a maybe with a little, I'd like more information, please. So that way I know when I'm looking to cast, if a singing actor has said, absolutely not, I'm really not interested in engaging with this moment on stage, great, then I'm not going to be someone who is there to ask them to do something that they don't want to do or try to convince them to reframe their boundaries for the sake of this role. Which leads us into our next point, casting and then time and scheduling. If I'm providing the attention right from the get-go of making stage intimacy a priority in this process, I also have to build it into my schedule, which can be a challenge, especially in opera when we have so little time and it is so precious. But I do really want to think about intimacy existing on the same level that, say, dance or fights would, so that we don't get toward the end and think, oh my goodness, we didn't do this one moment. Let's find a way to work it into the space. And this next point is hiring an intimacy director an option? Maybe. Hopefully, depending on a number of things. If so, great. But if not, there are so many resources and so many folks who are I think are really excited and willing and actively engaged with having these conversations with folks, so that you can feel like you're not alone if you're asked to stage something that might perhaps feel a little out of your comfort zone. All right, and then I'm going to flip the script a little bit and put on my ID hat. So as an ID, my perspective early on in the process, I'm asking these questions, minus the like, am I hiring myself? Because that's somebody else. But I'm asking, how am I engaging and communicating with the director and the production team early in this process? Am I being asked to sit in on production meetings? Has a director worked with an ID before? If not, I like to really go into detail about what it is that I offer and what it is that I can and cannot offer, so that way there are as little surprises as possible. And we'll have those conversations with directors who've also worked with IDs, just to make sure that we're on the same page as much as possible. Okay, now our next big essential of the 6 essentials, as it were, is consent. I had a lovely professor in graduate school during my time at Texas Tech who would use this phrase, having the 5-minute conversation on Monday before the 30-minute conversation on Friday. And I loved this, because I myself, as Lauren, am not an inherently confrontational person, and that makes me a little nervous. So the idea of immediately addressing a sticky moment can feel a little daunting for me personally. But if I think about it in this context of, let's address anything and everything that we might need to know early on, it's going to save us a world of potential hurt later on down the road. So here's how we go about doing this. We are looking, when we're talking about consent for stage intimacy, we're looking to communicate our physical boundaries to our scene partner or partners, depending on the moment. And we're trying to figure out how we as a collective can respect those boundaries. Because your boundaries can and may change, I work with a number of young singers who will often ask, or I'll notice a moment of questioning in their eyes, because the question they're asking themselves is, what if I don't know where my boundaries are? Or nobody's ever asked me, or my boundaries are the quote unquote normal ones. But what is quote unquote normal to me or expected to me might be different than what is expected of you, right? So we have to take a little bit of a step back and think in clinical, non-vague language about where on our physical beings we are open to touch from another creative in the space. Your boundaries are beautiful. You don't need to change them. You don't need to justify them. They are what they are, and that's great. Consent is always revocable. Now, I do offer this caveat as well, which is consent is always revocable. However, just as singing actors have their boundaries, directors can have their non-negotiables, which might look like, for example, if we are staging a collective, a Romeo and Juliet, and we are really, really interested in rooting the intimacy in that world in the embedded stage directions of, say, the Romeo and Juliet's first meeting, the hand-to-hand Holy Palmer's kiss. All right, so that might be a moment that is really important to me as a director to need that kiss. So if ultimately an actor is not willing to engage with that moment, there's no harm, no foul on my end, but it is important to know that there is a possibility where I, as the director, might have the tough conversation of, okay, well, maybe this is a moment in which an understudy or a cover comes on, right? This might not be the right role for you at this time. Now, that conversation could look different. I could say, all right, this is an interesting moment of challenge. So how can we make this moment intimate in another way, But it's important to know, and to, especially for any young singers in the space with us today, to know that could be a potential response. Now, you might be asking yourself, oh my goodness, this is a large conversation. How do we go about having this? And there really are a number of ways, depending on the director, the intimacy director in the room. I love the boundary exercise that Chelsea Pace offers in her fantastic book, Staging Sex. It's very, very clear and fast. So I really love that. I've also worked with folks who prefer to like physically write out what their boundaries are as sort of a living, breathing document, or they prefer to have a conversation rather than the physicalized showing of where boundaries exist on their person, such as the boundary exercise that Pace offers in her text. So it really depends. There is no wrong or right way necessarily. But the most important part is that it's clear and that we're not operating on a basis of, oh, my boundaries are the obvious ones or the usual ones. Because again, that might look different for different folks. Okay. Now, once we've established this, before we've even made any kind of contact with our partner, we always have dramaturgy living as a rain cloud of sorts, or a sunbeam. That's a little more optimistic, perhaps, of a metaphor. And I ask myself these questions all throughout the process, whether I'm building a moment, whether we're looking at bodies creating a moment, whether we're seeing how it looks under the lights. I'm always asking myself, how does this moment of intimacy fit in the context of this story, the story of this opera? What purpose does it serve for the characters in the plot? Is this kiss a declaration of love? Is it a declaration of lust? Is it an apology? Does it look like an apology now under the beautiful shiny lights as much as it did when we were in the linoleum rehearsal room floor? And if not, what do I need to do to make those adjustments? And then the last one is, what is the mood or atmosphere like during this moment? Should this be a relief? Is this the apex of a pyramid that we've been building to, right? And we note that these conversations, these check-ins, are moments that are rooted in the world of the opera, the world of the play. It's not dedicated to me asking about the personal lives of the cast members or sharing my own personal intimate life, because we're not performing that story. We're performing the story of these characters. Now, the fourth essential, choreography, is a giant one. So is consent, but choreography I've broken down into basically three parts. The first one being logistics, the second one being some choreography basics, and then the last is a little example using our hypothetical Romeo and Juliet example that we've selected. Namely, because if you don't know, it's Shakespeare's birthday today on the day that this is being recorded. So a nod to him. Yeah, there we go. So a couple of logistical questions for us. All right, the first question is, who is in the room when we are staging intimacy? I normally will encourage the following. The first being the actors and singing actors whom engage in said intimate moment, the stage manager, the assistant director, if there is one. Now, I personally prefer to choreograph with an understudy or a cover cast separately, because while they're involved in the same moment of storytelling, they're different sets of bodies, different boundaries, and they deserve just as much time as their non-cover, non-understudy counterparts. Another logistical item to consider is how many breaks we're taking, especially when we're doing really sensitive or potentially sensitive subject matter like sexual violence. We want to make sure that we're giving everyone enough time to breathe and root back to self rather than live in the headspace of the character. I invite singing actors to come dressed to work. So if there's a moment where we're say doing something in period and we're moving down to the ground and then back up again, or we're doing any kind of weight sharing, I'll really encourage, if there are folks who are wearing skirts, to bring in something that is equivalent to that, because your body will feel quite different when you're wearing a garment that's more similar to what your costume is, as opposed to potentially your everyday rehearsal wear. When to block what is an interesting question, and it varies largely depending on the director. Usually my preference as an ID and as a director is to block moments as they arise, and that's oftentimes a perfect world scenario. Usually what happens is that an ID is brought in on a weekend or a couple of weekends to do all of the moments. And so you don't necessarily get that quite that same experience because you're sort of doing everything all at once. But if you're directing and you're also blocking the intimacy or choreographing the intimacy as a director, you have a little more flexibility in that realm. So the reason though I like doing this is because it avoids the potential of having the actors or the singers make the rehearsal schedule, because there's sort of I think an oddness that can come from, oh, well, you tell me when you're okay to do the kiss. Because then what happens is there's a moment of, well, I wasn't okay to kiss you on Tuesday, but now that it's Friday, I'm fine. Well, what's happened between Tuesday and Friday? I don't know. I'd rather not. Personally, as a actor, I don't want to make that decision myself. I'd rather just have that as a part of the schedule. Now, if a moment is either really involved or perhaps of a little more sensitive nature, I'll put that usually a little later in the rehearsal schedule so that folks have time to build up a rapport with one another. We're not staging perhaps the most challenging choreography right off the bat. How much time do you have to stage? Oh, this is so tricky. This is really tricky. I oftentimes will say as much time as I possibly can have. This is what I would like. Again, a perfect world scenario, right? But it largely depends on what it is that you're staging and how many folks are involved in the moment. Questions I always ask, are there going to be microphones? If there are microphones, are they microphones that come through hairlines? Are they coming up behind ears, right? Because if I know that somebody is, say, wearing a mic that comes down through their face, I have to be very, very mindful that those sides of the face are not touching. Nobody's hand is blocked to coincide with where a mic is stationed, as well as we don't want to get any kind of fingers tangled in mic wires. That's always not fun to deal with on stage. And then costuming, again, is a huge one, especially if costumes have to come off or on at any particular moment of time. And is that facilitated by the singer? Don't know. Lighting is important. I need to know, are we seeing all of them? Are we just only seeing them in silhouette? How long do we get to see them for? Is this a moment where we start to see the beginning of an action or a moment and then we cut to black? If so, what happens if we miss that cue or we're a little bit late? Because we have to create a buffer then for that moment. And then scenic. Ooh, this is one of the meatiest production elements to contend with, especially if any kind of scenic element has to be weight bearing. Walls, chairs, beds. Does anything have wheels on it? If it has wheels on it, can it maybe not have wheels on it? what are the mechanisms that lock these wheels, right? Because even if they lock, if you've ever been on rolling casters, there's still that little moment of give and take that happens. So I want to know as much as possible before I'm going to craft anything for folks to do. I see something here in the chat, so I'm going to check it out real quick. Woo Shakespeare. Yes, woo Shakespeare. Thank you for that. The last one is, okay, what's the style of acting? Are we really intent on making this as realistic as possible, meaning it looks like perhaps the world that we inhabit, or is this highly stylized? Is this done with puppetry? What exactly are we dealing with here stylistically? Is this an intimate moment between humans, between woodland dryads, mermaids, any number of things? And then my last one is a special opera caveat, which is, where is the conductor and when do the singers need to see them? And do they both, or do all three of them need to see the conductor, or does just one member? Do we need to have a visual cue to get us out of the kiss? Because what we don't want to have happen is a beautiful, wonderful, loving embrace happens, and then all of a sudden just one person's eyes turn out, because what that reads then to us is, oh, we've had this wonderful moment of love or whatever it is, but I'm also going to make sure I catch that baton. So not the end of the world, but in a perfect world, we're all working in tandem. So I will ask the singers, especially because they're the ones who will ultimately know exactly when they need that eye line, to say, okay, when do you need to catch the baton so that I can make sure we get you there. All right. Okay, moving on to a couple of choreography basics. Stage intimacy choreography is really similar to dance or fight choreo in specificity. We use desexualized language. So for example, what that might look like is, rather than say, I am going to, so here's how I would use desexualized language. I might say, in this particular moment, I am going to close distance between actor A and B, with actor A leading at about roughly a 3 count, with the front of their chest meeting actor B at eye line level, about 3 inches apart. Rather than saying, in this moment, actor A, I need you to put your boobs in actor B's face. First of all, not the most professional language, and a little activating, that language. So we desexualize it, and also so that everyone knows exactly what body parts we are talking about. Intimacy for the stage is not intimacy in real life. And this is something that I will constantly and lovingly remind folks, especially younger singers and actors, because for most of us, the most common instances in our day-to-day lives in which we encounter intimacy is private. So we're not necessarily, for most of us, used to portraying it on stage. So our brain is aware of that, and our bodies are amazing and cool. So it's like, hey, we're doing something we don't normally do. Let's protect ourselves. And so it tends to be folks tend to engage with intimate moments a little faster because our body is telling us we don't normally do this. And so we as the IDs have to slow it down, because everything needs a little bit more time for the audience to catch up with us, regardless of how well we know and can engage with our stories and characters. We need to give them time to board our train with us, so to speak. We also have to look at how music impacts time in this world. That's super important. A crescendo to the grand romantic kiss in an opera might feel like it lasts for ages for the singers. And whilst a challenge, there's also beauty in that, because that's the rule of this world. We have all this luscious, gorgeous time in which to build these moments as subtly and as grandly as possible. And then lastly, we do this using very specific choreographic elements, such as levels of touch, right? We talk about breath, center of gravity, tempo, duration, points of contact, whether it's lip to lip or full torso to full torso and with arms wrapped around the back, whether it's audible breath, high breath, low breath, what vocalizations or vocal gestures are being heard through this moment. And then we look at beats, right? How many beats does this moment have? If it's a singular kiss, a first kiss, that might look quite different than two lovers who have run off to be together in the forest. And they've been waiting all opera to do this. That might be a series of kisses, right? So we look at these elements to help us put together this pie that is an intimate moment on stage. And there's so many more of them. All right, so woo Shakespeare, he's back. This is a little tiny bit of Act 1, Scene 5 from Romeo and Juliet. It appears in a number of Romeo and Juliet opera adaptations. Pick your poison, so to speak, to use another R&J reference. So we're looking at this first kiss, the one that's in purple. And if we look at this text, Romeo says, "Oh, then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. They pray, grant thou, lest faith turn to despair." Because Juliet's so smart, she says, "Saints do not move, though grant for prayer's sake." And he responds, "And move not, while my prayers effect I take." And there's a little stage direction. That's a modern stage direction, but we think it might have happened. And this is everything that I would have as the ID for this one moment. My goodness. So, again, I'm not going to read it all to you, but I'll read the first little beat so that you kind of hear what it might sound like. So we're going to be again with our upstage palms together, skin to skin level of touch, meaning it's very soft, almost like petting a puppy. Romeo is going to close distance with their full body. Juliet's upstage hand drifts to the middle of his back, and he places his upstage hand on her upper back or shoulder, depending on the height of the actors. Romeo's downstage hand comes to the base of Juliet's hairline and ear with a skin-to-skin level of touch as to not disrupt her mask, because she's wearing a mask in this scene, and so is he. And he will guide her chin up to meet his own using a cupping motion of a hand. Her downstage hand will drift around Romeo's middle back, skin to skin, under her upstage hand. So she's going to be meeting the back of his back like this. The back of his back. That was redundant. This all happens 3 to 4 counts total. And then the moment continues on. Now you'll notice I've left a couple of options here, as well as a very, very basic outline. It's not super duper prescriptive, but it can be, or we can give ourselves less information and make parameters around this moment. And then there's some breath listed later on towards the end. So this is just one moment. All right, we're gonna zip on through to the next essential, almost towards the end, communication and follow through. Do we need an intimacy call? I would largely posit it depends. It depends on the what the singers feel they need in the moment. And then there's a couple of things to think about in regards to communicating, both with for singers and for directors. And then closure, the last of these 6 essentials, or last of these pillars. Chelsea Pace, again, the author of Staging Sex, offers Augusto Boal's de-rolling technique, which is lovely. It's essentially a technique that actors and singers can use to separate self from character, which is super helpful. I find that that works in my practice best when we have moments that are particularly sensitive or activating for singers. It can be as simple as a checking out moment, a like, you know, fist to fist bump, or like a little elbow bump when you're coming off stage. It can be a moment of eye contact with your scene partner, just as like a, hey, I, as Lauren, appreciate that you, Abby, had my back in this moment. Thank you. Moving on. And she knows, hey, I got you. I got your back too. And we're like, awesome. Thank you, Abby, for being my scene partner in this moment. And then again, as an ID, I always ask to be a part of any kind of post-show meetings, wrap-ups, so that I can get a feel for how the process went for folks. Now, there are so many additional considerations that we are not going to tackle in great detail in this particular presentation, but I offer them to you. If there's a rabbit hole that you're interested in talking about, by all means, I'm excited and thrilled to go down the rabbit holes, but we haven't talked about training and study. How do I learn more about this? How do I become an ID? What kind of personalities do IDs tend to have, or tend to really love this work, right? I won't talk necessarily a whole lot about nudity, but there's a whole industry dedicated to modesty garments and barriers that are utilized in scenes that involve nudity. Intimacy coordination, we can talk about quite briefly. So intimacy directors engage with performance that is done in a live medium, meaning opera, theater, musical theater, dance. Intimacy coordination are the theater equivalent, but for televised filmed medium. So any kind of Netflix show that you might see that lists an intimacy coordinator, they work predominantly in that arena. Some intimacy directors are coordinators, some coordinators are directors, and some work in only one of those two mediums. Working with minors, especially if you work in K-12 systems, there are so many additional considerations, especially in regards to consent. There are laws that are in place for minor safeties that vary from state to state. So please be mindful if you find that you work with minors in your day-to-day interactions that might potentially have moments of intimacy. The Kiss in the High School Musical, right, might be an example of this. Areas of interest or specialization are widespread. Not every intimacy director has to be the intimacy director for every project or everything. And that's okay, right? Just like we as singers have sort of our music that we love singing, and perhaps music that's a little outside of our comfort zone. Totally fine. Illness is topical. Important to keep in mind that we are having these conversations about how we can keep one another safe in close proximity, or is it even necessary to be in close proximity, right? So that's important. There's also plenty of ways to use placeholders, so placeholder actions, right? Rather than staging the kiss and doing it over and over and over again in an opera, we might just hold for a moment of a 3 count with eye contact so we know where that moment lives. But I'm not necessarily asking the singers to kiss each other every single night we run this scene or in tech rehearsals. Hygiene, this can be a little bit of an awkward conversation to have, but it's important, right? Just like if you were a part of a sports team, you wouldn't show up to like football practice without the necessary protective elements. You don't want to show up for the staging rehearsal in which you know you're working on the kiss, having just eaten your onion and tuna fish sandwich, right? You save that for after rehearsal, just so we can continue to all be supportive and good and kind colleagues to one another. There's so many more elements, folks, that we don't have time in this brief moment that we have with one another. But I offer these to you because they're exciting and they're fun to explore. This is not an exhaustive list of resources, but these are a couple of large ones, and mostly folks who are based in the United States. So please feel free to check them out. Ancy James and Intimacy Directors of Color can be found at intimacydirectorsofcolor.com. Chelsea, who I've referenced a number of times, as well as IDC, they're all listed here. There's a snazzy group on Facebook called Intimacy Choreographers, Coordinators, and Educators Resource Group, which is a very long title, but is exactly what it says that it is. And there's a number of folks in there who are always willing to answer questions that individuals will post to the group, as well as SAG-AFTRA's recently announced standards and protocols. And then again, there's so many more depending on your country, if you're coming from outside of the US, really depending on where you're based. Okay, pictured here are a couple of intimacy coordinators, since I haven't shouted out most of them, but more recent work that's really exciting and inspiring to me, so shout out to them, and they're all listed here. All right, my goodness, I feel like I have just talked y'all's ear off. What questions do you have? I'm gonna go ahead and escape our share for just a second. I can find my mouse again. There it is. Okay. Oh, okay. I'm going to look at the chat first, and I'll address this question. And then if you have another question or a moment that you craved clarity on, since I knew this was a lot of information all at once, please feel free to put it in the chat or come on camera. All right. I'm seeing from, I believe it's Ivy. Please correct me if I'm wrong. The question, what does it mean to try a curve as in the R&J intimacy choreography described? Absolutely. So when I say try a curve, I'm looking at a curved shape on the back with a hand or an arm so that we can avoid what I lovingly call the cheerleader kiss, which kind of feels like 5, 6, 7, 8. We're closing lips and now we're not. So a kiss that feels very static, maybe doesn't have a whole lot of movement or texture to it. We'll try a shape. And one of the, I think, kind of easiest shapes to incorporate when we have arms wrapped around another body is a shape that the audience can see. So they'll be able to see whatever hand is closest to them, articulating some kind of gesture, which then shows that this is a moment of consensual intimacy between these two characters. But beautiful question. Thank you for asking. Does anybody else have any questions?
I actually had a follow-up question.
Sure.
When you were saying who's in the room the first time that you worked together, is the director usually not present for that, or did I miss that? Because I know I could have spaced out for a second.
If I did not include them, thank you for clarifying. Yes. So
okay.
usually
Maybe I missed it. I don't know. But I also kind of thought like, oh, well, maybe that is because there's like a power dynamic of the director. Like if that's something, if the director is cool with it, has it been just you without the director and the actors?
Yes and yes. In that, yes, occasionally I will encounter or work with directors who will say, all right, take the actors, go work on this moment, and then bring it back and show me. Or I'm going to go do this other moment with other members of the cast. It really kind of depends on if I'm brought in to work when the whole cast is there, because normally they'll sort of try and utilize a continuous rehearsal.
Right.
Now, if I'm sort of the only element that's on the schedule, and I've spoken to the director, so that's another element too. I'll ask directors, so here's kind of the modes of how we can collaborate. One being, you and I have a conversation before this Romeo and Juliet cast and you tell me, oh, you know, so here's what I'm envisioning. And then I'll tell you, okay, I'm going to get it as close as we possibly can. As close as we can, depending on what works for these individuals in this space. I can work with them and then come back with you, or I'd love to have you in the space so that you can see the work that we're creating, and I can turn to you if you have if you have questions or a moment isn't quite shaken out the way that you've envisioned, because absolutely I want to make sure that they, regardless of which way they prefer working, that they're happy with the end product, because it saves us ultimately all time. But I often find that directors appreciate and again, it depends. But I think most folks that I've worked with appreciate being a part of the conversation in the room, because it feels a little bit less like we're doing our own secret thing and then we'll come back and join you. But there's not really a judgment one way or the other. It's sort of personal preference.
Nice. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. I see another question in the chat. Okay, I do have one more question. Obviously, it's super preferable to have an intimacy director involved, but we still may often as actors end up in projects where one has not been hired, consulted, and where we don't have the power to demand one. How can we as actors advocate for ourselves, each other respectfully, but effectively in a traditional opera director cast power dynamic rehearsal room? Great question, Ivy. My first offering to you would be to operate from a place where, if you can, to assume goodwill on behalf of the director and on behalf of your colleagues. Now, some situations it depends, but largely for the by and large, the most part, most folks want the people they work with to feel safe and supported. So I would offer maybe a couple of different ideas. One being to have a conversation with the director using really specific language and specific moments in the opera. So for example, hey, director Ted, I'm so excited to do this Don Giovanni with you. This is my absolute dream role. I'm so excited. I did, however, have a question about this moment after this, insert moment here, after this trio, after this duet, because I really want to make sure that it's a moment that I am acting in concert with my scene partner, that I'm respecting their boundaries and vice versa, and that we're creating something that looks really exciting. I'd love to sit down and chat with you more about this. What are your thoughts? And then hopefully, like best case scenario, this person turns to you and says, oh my goodness, yes, thank you. Let's absolutely chat about it. They might have an idea in place of how to go about doing that. There might be the opportunity for you to say, hey, I've been reading, I've been researching, I have these sources X, Y, and Z to turn to say, maybe here's how I've seen folks utilize a boundary practice. I'd be curious about maybe utilizing this in my work. How would you feel if we did this? And then I would say, if you're met with perhaps the alternative of, oh, well, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. We'll just do it when we get to it. And you don't feel supported. You can also turn to a stage manager, but you can also not employ like hire, but like bring into the fold your scene partner to say, hey, you know what? I'm a little unsure, might not be the best word, but I have some concerns about this moment. I want to make sure that I'm respecting your boundaries and vice versa, and that we're creating something that is that's really clear for us both. And then I'd use desexualized language, right, as specific as possible, to eliminate as much vagueness as possible, right? So moments of what can not be helpful is like, okay, so we're just gonna just do the kiss. Oh, that can look like so many different things. And then there can be a considerable amount of, well, this person did this thing, so what does this mean? And how do I, that's a lot. So I think continuing to root yourself in your technique as an actor and a singing actor is really important, but to make your concerns known. And I think that if you continue to operate from a place of goodwill and to be really specific about what it is that you need and continue to kind of walk that walk, so to speak, that that it alerts folks that, oh, hey, I maybe didn't put so much thought into this as a director, but I really should be. Does that answer your question, Ivy?
That does. Thank you so much. That's really helpful.
Awesome, thank you. I that can be a really stressful space to be in, but thank you for asking that question, because it's important, and I think one that a number of us have had to contend with. Wonderful. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat.
I'm not either. I'm gonna put a few more business items in the chat, since people may be wrapping things up. But Lauren, why don't you go ahead and close us out? And if anybody has follow-up questions, I'm sure there are plenty of resources to offer them.
Absolutely. So I offer our little closure moment, which is regardless of where you are, whether or not you want to turn your camera on, it's groovy. But what I invite you to do in this moment is to make eye contact with somebody in space, even if you're making eye contact towards one of their lovely photos. And we're just going to simply take a moment of breath. Inhale and exhale. And then collectively, we are going to finish with a group clap all at the same time on the count of 3. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Bravo, everyone. Beautiful. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I greatly appreciate you sharing your time and energy. It's really, really lovely seeing you all. If you have any questions or you want to chat further, please find me. I think all my info is linked on my website. But yeah, thank you. Have a really lovely afternoon or evening, wherever you are.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you for everybody for attending. If you liked what you saw tonight, I did put links to our website, our social media, our upcoming productions. We have a fundraiser coming up. We have one more of these series next week. Samantha Williams is going to talk about American patriotism, sort of her version of patriotism and classical music. So we're really excited. That's next Saturday, same time, same location as Zoom. We have a fundraising gala coming up in June. We have an opera production coming up in August. And we have so many fun projects, and we're so grateful to Lauren for giving her time today, and all of you for joining us. And I hope you all have a beautiful rest of your weekend.